praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition. It's time for the GunGuyTV podcast.
Hi, this is Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for listening to GunGuyTV and the audio podcast here. I'm grateful for the fact that you listen and for the growth we're experiencing with the podcast, which is really terrific. I mean, it's growing a lot. It's not obviously as popular as the YouTube channel because the YouTube channel's been around a long time, but the podcast is growing, and I'm very, very grateful. Thank you very much for your support. I do want to let you know that this podcast is 1 hour long, typically, and sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little less, but basically it's an hour long, the first half an hour of which is syndicated on your favorite podcast player. The next half an hour is not syndicated. That part is available only on Patreon. So if you would like to hear the entire podcast, then I urge you to please join us on Patreon, and you can hear the whole thing, which is kind of cool. It also helps fund the podcast because I don't make a living doing podcasts or YouTube. Despite what you might think, people don't become instant millionaires on YouTube or whatever. This is basically funded by the small company that my wife and I own. We do this as a labor of love. So anything that you provide goes right into helping us get this done, buying equipment, doing the kinds of things that are necessary, supplies and so on, and travel or whatever to produce videos on GunGuyTV's YouTube channel and also to produce this podcast. So I urge you to check us out on Patreon. You can hear the entire podcast, and it helps us out a ton. This is June 5th, 2019. I was going to have a podcast on a totally different subject, and then I thought, you know what, tomorrow, June 6th, is the anniversary of the D-Day landing, the D-Day invasion. I had just recently run across an article written by Ernie Pyle that he actually distributed or published on the 12th of June, 1944, after he walked on the beach at Normandy. Now, he didn't arrive with the troops. The schedule didn't work out so that he could be there. He arrived shortly thereafter. And in case you don't know who Ernie Pyle was, he was a war correspondent, and prior to that, he had traveled the country reporting on the Great Depression and done a fabulous series of columns that were human interest columns on how people were surviving and what was happening to them and the little stories behind the scenes of the Great Depression. So Ernie Pyle was a columnist who was very well known to the American public back in the 40s, and he went with the military to report on the war. He wrote a column out of Normandy, which again was sent out on the 12th of June, 1944, after the initial invasion. A couple of things you got to understand about the way things were done back then is during the war, there were no, not like today, we didn't have the kind of technology they had back then, and there were also censors who had to read the stuff that these guys wrote and approve it before it could be sent out. So to some degree, it needed to have a positive spin for the folks back home, even though sometimes things were not looking all that positive, or it was pretty bleak and miserable wherever Mr. Pyle happened to be. So as I go through this article with you, which I'm going to read for you because I think it's fascinating, you get to experience and see what the soldiers went through when they had to land on the beach in a very clear and graphic way. Understand, too, that he couldn't get too detailed about it because it never would have gotten past the censors. So here is the article written by Ernie Pyle after he walked on the beach. June 12, 1944, Normandy beachhead. Due to a last-minute alteration in the arrangements, I didn't arrive on the beachhead until the morning after D-Day, after our first wave of assault troops had hit the shore. By the time we got there, the beaches had been taken and the fighting had moved a couple of miles inland. All that remained on the beach was some sniping and artillery fire, and the occasional startling blast of a mine geysering brown sand into the air. That, plus a gigantic and pitiful litter of wreckage along miles of shoreline. Submerged tanks and overturned boats and burned trucks and shell-shattered jeeps and sad little personal belongings were strewn all over these bitter sands. That, plus the bodies of soldiers lying in rows covered with blankets, the toes of their shoes sticking up in a line as though on drill, and other bodies, uncollected, still sprawling grotesquely in the sand or half hidden by the high grass beyond the beach. That plus an intense, grim determination of work-wearied men to get this chaotic beach organized and get all the vital supplies and the reinforcements moving more rapidly over it from the stacked-up ships standing in droves out to sea. Now that it is over, it seems to me a pure miracle that we ever took the beach at all. For some of our units it was easy, but in this special sector where I am now, our troops faced such odds that our getting ashore was like my whipping Joe Louis down to a pulp. In this column, I want to tell you what the opening of the second front in this one sector entailed, so that you can know and appreciate and forever be humbly grateful to those both dead and alive who did it for you. Ashore, facing us, were more enemy troops than we had in our assault waves. The advantages were all theirs, the disadvantages all ours. The Germans were dug into positions that they had been working on for months, although these were not yet all complete. 100-foot bluff, a couple of 100 yards back from the beach, had great concrete gun emplacements built right into the hilltop. These opened to the sides instead of to the front, thus making it very hard for naval fire from the sea to reach them. They could shoot parallel with the beach and cover every foot of it for miles with artillery fire. Then they had hidden machine gun nests on the forward slopes, with crossfire taking in every inch of the beach. These nests were connected by networks of trenches so that the German gunners could move about without exposing themselves. Throughout the length of the beach, running zigzag a couple of 100 yards back from the shoreline, was an immense V-shaped ditch 15 feet deep. Nothing could cross it, not even men on foot, until fills had been made. And in other places at the far end of the beach, where the ground is flatter, they had great concrete walls. These were blasted by our naval gunfire or by explosives set by hand after we got on shore. Our only exits from the beach were several swales or valleys, each about 100 yards wide. The Germans made the most of these funnel-like traps, sowing them with buried mines. They contained also barbed wire entanglements with mines attached, hidden ditches, and machine guns firing from the slopes. This is what was on the shore, but our men had to go through a maze nearly as deadly as this before they even got ashore. Underwater obstacles were terrific. The Germans had whole fields of evil devices under the water to catch our boats. Even now, several days after the landing, we have cleared only channels through them, and cannot yet approach the whole length of the beach with our ships. Even now, some ship or boat hits one of these mines every day and is knocked out of commission. The Germans had masses of those great six-pronged spiders made of railroad iron and standing shoulder-high just beneath the surface of the water for our landing craft to run into. They also had huge logs buried in the sand, pointing upward and outward, their tops just below the water. Attached to these logs were mines. In addition to these obstacles, they had floating mines offshore, land mines buried in the sand of the beach, and more mines in checkerboard rows in the tall grass beyond the sand. And the enemy had 4 men on shore for every 3 men we had approaching the shore. And yet, we got on. Beach landings are planned to a schedule that is set far ahead of time. They all have to be timed in order for everything to mesh and the following waves of troops to be standing off the beach and ready to land at the right moment. As the landings are planned, some elements of the assault force are to break through quickly, push on inland, and attack the most obvious enemy strongpoints. It is usually the plan for units to be inland, attacking gun positions from behind within a matter of minutes after the first men hit the beach. I have always been amazed at the speed called for in these plans. You'll have schedules calling for engineers to land at H hour plus 2 minutes, and service troops at H hour plus 30 minutes, and even for press sensors to land at H hour plus 75 minutes. But in this attack, on this special portion of the beach, where I am, the worst we had, incidentally, the schedule didn't hold. Our men simply could not get past the beach. They were pinned down right on the water's edge by an inhuman wall of fire from the bluff. Our first waves were on that beach for hours instead of a few minutes before they could begin working inland. You can still see the foxholes they dug at the edge of the water in the sand and the small, jumbled rocks that form parts of the beach. Medical corpsmen attended the wounded as best they could. Men were killed as they stepped out of the landing craft. An officer whom I knew got a bullet through the head just as the door of his landing craft was let down. Some men were drowned. The first crack in the beach defenses was finally accomplished by terrific and wonderful naval fire, which knocked out the big emplacements. They tell epic stories of destroyers that ran right up into shallow water and had it out point blank with the big guns in those concrete emplacements ashore. When the heavy fire stopped, our men were organized by their officers and pushed on inland, circling machine gun nests and taking them from the rear. As one officer said, the only way to take a beach is to face it and keep going. It is costly at first, but it's the only way. If the men are pinned down on the beach, dug in, or out of action, they might as well not be there at all. They hold up the waves behind them, and nothing is being gained. Our men were pinned down for a while, but finally they stood up and went through, and so we took that beach and accomplished our landing. We did it with every advantage on the enemy side and every disadvantage on ours. In the light of a couple of days of retrospection, we sit and talk and call it a miracle that our men ever got on at all or were able to stay on. Before long, it will be permitted to name the units that did it. Then you will know to whom this glory should go. They suffered casualties. And yet, if we take the entire beachhead assault, including other units that had a much easier time, our total casualties in driving this wedge into the continent of Europe were remarkably low, only a fraction, in fact, of what our commanders had been prepared to accept. And these units that were so battered and went through such hell are still, right at this moment, pushing on inland without rest, their spirits high, their egotism and victory almost reaching the smart-alecky stage. Their tails are up. We've done it again, they say. They figure that the rest of the Army isn't needed at all, which proves that while their judgment in this regard is bad, they certainly have the spirit that wins battles and even wars.
You're listening to the GunGuyTV podcast.
Now, I've got to tell you, that's a very cool column to read, because it gives you the perspective of a war correspondent who was there. He was walking down the beach afterward. Now, admittedly, he had to get the column past the censors, so he couldn't be, too descriptive of the horrors of it. But there are parts of that column that I never knew. I knew about the German defenses to a degree, but I didn't know until very recently in kind of studying it a little bit about the crossfire that they had set up. I didn't know about the mines and the obstacles that were under the water. I didn't know about a lot of these kind of things that these men faced coming off the landing craft and trying to make it up the beach. I didn't know, for example, that really, when you get right down to it, the first wave or two of soldiers darn near had no chance whatsoever. I mean, they came off those landing craft and they had very little chance of survival, and yet they did it anyway. I'm always encouraged by going back and looking at that time, because I see the greatness of our country in those men, and I see the greatness of the country in Rosie the Riveter and the women that stayed behind and built machinery and tanks and became welders and and machinists and whatever in order to bolster the war effort to fight for our country. I maybe that's sappy or something, but I don't think so. I come back from these things and I say, well, gee, you know what? When I was a kid, as I said, I'm in my 60s. When I was a kid, I knew quite a number of people in my family who were World War II veterans. Now, they were, older, but not old at the time. And I, as a small child, have memories of sitting on the porch swing with a couple of them and having them talk to me about humorous things that happened to them during the war. They didn't talk about the battle so much, if ever, with me, but they did talk about humorous things. They talked about some of their buddies. I can remember hearing them talk about their buddies, and once in a while, they would be talking about a buddy who obviously didn't make it, and then the emotion of that would hit them. But that was in the time when men were taught you don't cry. Men don't cry, and so they would choke that back. They wouldn't let that be seen too much. I'm not sure that was terribly healthy for them, but nevertheless, that's the way things were. Regardless, though, I look at these guys from that time, and every time June 6th comes around, I'm reminded of what an incredible thing D-Day was, of how many men were involved in it, and how incredibly brave they were. I'm going to be terribly honest with you right here. I'm going to tell you that if I was in one of those landing craft at that time, I would have been totally, utterly petrified. I don't know about you, but I would have been absolutely petrified. Watching movies like Saving Private Ryan and watching some of these World War II movies, but I got to be honest with you, just the idea of being involved in that is horrifying. I've never been in a war. I speak from the perspective of a non-veteran. I've never been in a war zone. I've never been in the military, so I'm a complete noob here. I cannot speak from experience about any of this. So I've never been a soldier, and in any case, I probably don't have the courage to be one, maybe. I don't know. But I always marvel at veterans. I really do. And then, like I said, it may sound campy, but I have an enormous respect for people who serve in America's military. I really do. I have an enormous respect for the men and women who served during World War II. They really were, from the men and women who served to the men and women who worked hard in the United States and sacrificed to make sure that those people had the supplies and equipment they needed to win the war. I am convinced, having known many of them, that they were the greatest generation this country has ever had. But that said, on this anniversary of D-Day, not today, because this is the 5th, arguably, but you may be listening to this later on, I don't know, but I'm recording this on June 5th. But tomorrow is the anniversary, and when we think about these kinds of anniversary dates, whether it's the D-Day anniversary or December 7th, 1941, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, or we get into November where we're talking about the birthday ball for the Marine Corps or Veterans Day, Memorial Day, or any of those kind of things, we do ourselves a great harm if we forget the incredible sacrifice of the people who fought for this country, bled for this country, and provided for us a freedom we wouldn't otherwise have. Now, admittedly, we can talk about the Second Amendment and how those freedoms have been whittled away for many, many years, and they are. I'm in California. Trust me, I get it. Okay. But we still have the freedom to fight for those. We still have the court system. We still have a political system in which we can vote. We can take steps to change those laws. We can work on those things. And the reason why we have all of that and we don't live in a dictatorship is because of veterans who have fought for this country in various places around the world. Now, I'm going to stop right here, and I'm going to say this. World War II makes sense to most Americans I ever talked to. They look at the reason for World War II, the reason the Americans got involved, the reason why the U.S. got involved in it makes sense. We were bopping along trying not to be involved, and then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor without provocation, and so we got involved in the war. And we set out some clear goals, it seems to me. One was to crush the Japanese imperialism, and the other was to destroy the Nazism and fascism coming out of Europe. And we did those things. I mean, we didn't do them just at the United States, but along with our allies, we accomplished those goals. Every conflict and war the country has been in since in my lifetime, and that includes the Korean War. My father was a veteran in the Air Force during the Korean War. All of those have been sort of muddied as to why, at least in the minds of Americans. Why were we in Korea? Why were we in Vietnam? My brother Rick, for whom I have enormous respect, is a military veteran from the Army and served in combat in Vietnam. Why were we in those things? Why were we in Afghanistan? Why are we in Afghanistan? Why did we go to Iraq? All those things are kind of muddy, but the one thing that is not muddy and must not be muddy and must be clear in our minds and hearts in every instance is that the men and women who served. They served with bravery, with courage, and with distinction. Some of us have got to admit the fact that we might not have been brave enough to do it, and hold those folks who did serve up and look at them with admiration and respect.
Saving the Second Amendment, one episode at a time. This is the GunGuyTV podcast.
Now, one of the things that has changed dramatically is the fact that because of medical advances, many veterans who are injured today horribly survive when back in the 40s they didn't. They died. And so we have a lot of veterans who've come home and they're missing limbs, or they've been horribly disfigured, or they're just really horribly injured. And here's where I think, if I'm going to lay down a challenge here the day before the D-Day anniversary among Second Amendment supporters, is that we must not look away from our veterans simply because they've been horribly injured. I've seen people do that. I have personally seen people do that, turn away. I will not do it. I will not do it. These men and women have served their country. Whether I understand why they were where they were or not doesn't matter. What matters is they served their country, and they did that for me. I will never forget that. I will always be grateful for that. And at every opportunity ever given me, I will express that to them. I routinely, whenever I find out somebody's a veteran or I see them wearing their uniform or whatever, I walk up to them and thank them for their service. If I have an opportunity to buy their lunch, their coffee, their dinner, whatever, I will do it. Because they are doing something I've never done. I've never been in a war, as I said. I've never been in the military, so I cannot claim the valor that they own, that they earn. I cannot claim the respect that they deserve. So as we go, today, tomorrow, or the next day, and, you think about June, and you think, well, back in 1944, that was a horrific day. It might be sunny and nice in San Diego. You might be barbecuing on the weekend or whatever, but we got to remember when these types of anniversaries come up, whether it's the D-Day anniversary or Memorial Day or Veterans Day or the Marine Corps birthday ball coming up in November or whatever. It's important that we remember what has been done for us. Because, okay, look, like I said, I've said this many times. I'll say it again. I may have said it a few minutes ago. I don't know. I don't know. But I have said this many, many times. We live in a free country because of the sacrifice of our service members. And even though I'm in San Diego, where I can tell you that the Second Amendment is being attacked all the time, we still have the ability to fight back on those battles because of what these people did. And we should never, ever, ever forget that. The whole reason we still live in a free nation where we have the ability to change laws and vote for people and the kinds of things we can do in this country that in other countries some folks can't do is precisely because we have people who have served so gallantly and so valiantly in our military in various places. And these anniversaries, like the one coming up tomorrow for D-Day, are reminders of that. When you go over to the war memorials, they're reminders of that. When you walk through the national cemeteries and you see the crosses of all those who have served and paid the ultimate price and died for this country, we're reminded of that. And I guess in this podcast, I simply wanted to let you know how deeply I feel about it, how important it is that in every way we honor our veterans at every opportunity. So I urge you to do that. Please do. I will. In fact, if you're thinking about sending me a donation, use that money and go buy a veteran lunch or go buy a veteran's coffee. I'll live without the donation, although it's very nice and I do appreciate it. But let's take care of our military members as well. Well, that's going to be the first part of the podcast. I'm going to wrap it up here. I am going to talk about some current events in this next part of the podcast, which is going to be on Patreon only. So if you're with me on Patreon. Stick around. We're going to talk about suppressors and why we should be able to use them. Just very recently, we had a horrible shooting where a gentleman, why am I calling him a gentleman? He was a nut job. Took two 45 caliber pistols, I believe, one of which had a suppressor, and he killed a bunch of folks at his work. I'm going to talk about that briefly, but then, of course, the president was asked about suppressors, and he said something to the effect of, I don't really like them. Well, he should like them, and I'm going to explain why he should like them in the second part of the podcast. I'm going to explain why we need them as citizens in the second part of the podcast. And the reasons I give you may be reasons you haven't thought of. Maybe not. I don't know. But if you're on Patreon, stick around and you'll find out what those are. If you're not on Patreon, I'm going to wrap up the podcast here and urge you to join us on Patreon. Thank you very much for listening, for all of your support. Have a wonderful week. Make sure you reach out to a veteran and thank them for the service. And wherever you go, whatever you do, please be safe.
You've been listening to the GunGuy TV podcast.